This is the Red Podcast.
It's Red Podcast. David Hooper here. If you've got a message to spread, you are in the right place because that is what we talk about here on Red Podcast. We talk about podcasting, live events, email marketing, smoke signals, whatever you got. I'm going to show you how to use it to spread your message more effectively, get people to care about what you're talking about, and make money with that message. This episode is kind of about podcasting, but not really. It's more specifically about the kind of knowledge that you pick up along the way. Even if you don't have a podcast, you're going to get a lot out of it. But a quick warning before I get too far into this episode, you're going to want to do a podcast at the end of this if you don't have one already. It shows the power of podcasting. It's also going to show you what you bring to the table as a podcast host, even if you don't think of yourself as a podcaster. My guest, Zita Christian. Almost every podcaster I know has an interesting story about how they got into podcasting. Lots of people from radio, lots of celebrities who needed an outlet. Zita has an interesting story. It wasn't really by accident, though. Not like so many of us, myself included. Zita has a podcast called Ritual Recipes. The website is ritualrecipes.net. Her story is this. I think it's one of the most interesting things about her. She didn't start podcasting until she was 70. And that's one of the things that I think you're going to find about this story that's inspiring, even if you don't have a podcast. And it's going to be something that you're going to be able to relate to, even if you're not close to 70. One of the things that I want you to pay special attention to is the attitude that she brings when it comes to podcasting and also life. In the previous episode, I talked about having to change your business up as you get older. Hopefully what happens is you start to work smarter, not harder. You learn to channel your energy a bit better than you did previously. And you should, if you're out living your life, you should bring perspective to your business. I think that's really important for this business, the expert business. We think of it sometimes as a tech business. For example, I'm talking about podcasting, and a lot of people will think, oh, that's technical. You've got to know tech to do podcasting. Maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about that aspect of it with Zita in this conversation. But what podcasting really is a connection business. And as you grow older, you should be able to connect with different people, more people, connect with people in different ways, better than you were when you were younger. You've got so many more experiences to draw from, so much more knowledge to draw from. And because podcasting and the expert business is a connection business, you're going to be so much better at it than you would have been when you were younger. So in that case, age is a real plus. But at the same time, there's some things that we can get soft on. Because as we get older, as we get more successful, sometimes we think we're working smarter. We're not. What we're actually doing is something that's going to hurt us in the long run. That is something that I talk about with Zita on this episode. She's one of those people that just jumps in, and when you see it from the outside, you think, oh, she just jumps in. It's easy for her. We get into that too. She makes it appear easy, but just like creating a podcast, there are a lot of mistakes on this podcast that I'm hearing in the studio now. I make a mistake, I go back, I redo it. You never hear it. Your business is likely the same way. If you've got a book, it gets edited. If you've got a speech, you practice it. We don't see the first draft. We don't see the third or fourth draft sometime. We see the final product that took years to make. Because of that, and even knowing how the sausage gets made, it gets confusing to us. We think, oh, it's just easy for them. Not necessarily. Speaking of that, a quick background on this episode, just to give you an idea of how this happened. What I had planned to do when I first started talking to Zita, I just wanted to do a quick interview to talk about how she got involved with podcasting later on in life. I was curious about that, but the purpose of the interview, speaking of somebody who just jumps in, was to show her how to use Squadcast, which is a remote interviewing tool. It lets me sit in my room in Nashville and you, wherever you are, be in your space, but it makes it sound like we're in the same room. And I was just showing her that. But as somebody who's lived a very interesting life when it comes to media, she's had several books published, she's done plays, she's had a television show. She had such great insight into podcasting and spreading a message, I kept going. In fact, The part of this conversation you're going to hear on this episode, it is part of a longer conversation. I think you're going to get a lot out of it, especially if you're somebody considering jumping into podcasting and getting your message out. The next part, that's coming soon. For now, let me introduce you to Zita Christian of Ritual Recipes. Zita, you're the person that I call the oldest podcaster that I know. Right now, you are how old?
72.
And you got into podcasting at what age?
I actually really started like wholeheartedly at 70.
So 70 years old. And did you have any podcasting mentors that are in their 60s or older podcasting mentors and people that you listen to?
Not so much before I started. I found mentors. I knew I needed mentors. I knew I was going into an area that I didn't know a lot about, knew very little about, except that it existed. I had a friend who told me about podcasting several years before that, but the concept was so strange. And at the time, I didn't feel, oh, this is for me. But I will say that I had that little tingle that comes every now and then. And I know that whatever the it is, I'm going to come back to it. So when I decided that I did want to try a podcast, I started looking around. And interestingly, I found somebody, I really and truly don't remember his name, but he has an Australian accent. And he seemed very down on people he labeled gurus. And I wasn't quite sure what he was so upset about. And this particular episode I listened to, Dave Jackson was the guest.
The podcasting guru, ironically.
Well, and that was the thing. And I thought everything that I heard this man, Dave Jackson, talking about, I thought, my gosh, he sounds not only helpful and knowledgeable, but he also sounded so humble. Yeah. And I thought, how could this guy from Australia be down on this Dave Jackson guy? Because he sounds like somebody I would want to work with. Yeah. So when that interview finished, I just made a note and I thought, well, the guy from Australia, he's working through some problems of his own. But this guy, Dave Jackson, is somebody I need to find out more about him. And so I started following him, listening to his podcasts, and then I'm enrolled in the actual school of podcasting. So I would say he was my primary and first real podcast mentor when I got involved in podcasting for myself.
Let's take it back for a second, because you have experience with traditional media. You had, for a number of years, a television show, an interview-based television show.
Yes.
That you did. You have done theater. You have published books. So you know media. But podcasting, I guess you said you'd heard about it but didn't really understand what it was. Talk about how you discovered podcast and why you thought that tingle, as you say, that intuition that it might be something for you.
What happened was the television shows that I'm involved with, and I do want everybody to understand, this is local community television. This is public access television. And everybody involved in it, except the people who work at the television studio, we're all volunteers. We're all amateurs. I found great creative satisfaction in doing these shows. And I started back in 2001. I did it as a favor to a friend. And then it evolved, and I realized it was something I liked. Well, in the process, what I learned was about myself. I learned that I liked that creative expression. I liked to be able to share information. But through those shows, because they were all interview-based shows, the information I was sharing was almost always coming from someone else. I was facilitating it. I was asking the questions so that the guest would provide information. But there were a couple of times when the night before I was supposed to do a show, the guest contacted me and said that he or she couldn't make it. And I thought, okay, I have the studio reserved, and I'm certainly not the only one here in the community reserving the space. So I just thought it would be wasteful. It would be unprofessional of me not to use the space because I've had it reserved. Everyone on my crew, they're all volunteers. They've rearranged their schedules to be on the show. So I thought I'll just do a show by myself and I'll talk about something that I know about. And it's a half-hour show. I can talk for a half hour. So I did. It worked out really well. And so in the back of my mind, I thought, I can do this if I have to. Like if there's an emergency, I could do this. I could do a show on my own. Now, fast forward about 2 years. My husband is ill. He has Alzheimer's. And what has happened because of that is I am looking for ways to reduce stress for him. And it's less stressful if we do things from home or we go only to places that are very familiar to him. So I thought being in the studio with guests, and sometimes the guests bring spouses or friends, and we all have dinner together afterwards, and it's stressful. So I thought I need to do something other than the television show. I mean, right now I'm running reruns and have been for the past couple of months, and I don't know how much longer I'll do that. But what I sat down and thought, okay, what could I do from home that would still give me the creative fulfillment and tick off those boxes about providing information that I think would be helpful to someone? And that's when the little tingle came back. And I thought, podcasting, because of course by this time I'd listened to a lot of podcasts. And I thought, okay, I'm going to jump in that pool and see what I can do with it.
There are a couple of things I want to touch on. First is tech. Now, when you were doing the television show, and this is probably true for when you were doing book publishing as well, you were publishing for major publishers. So
Yes.
Your job was to create the content. You wrote
Right.
it. You had editors, you had layout people, you had the people who put it on the shelves, distributed it, marketed it.
Yes.
With television, you had a tech crew there as well. You've got cameramen, you've got, I guess, an editor. I'm not sure what's involved with television, having not worked in it that much, but you were primarily in charge of the content. Is that correct?
I did the content, but I also did a lot of before and post-production. I did almost everything that a producer would do, with one major exception. Because I filmed at a television studio, I had assigned to me an employee of the television studio. My advisor, his name was Greg. So my advisor would help me if I had questions about how should I approach this. Not so much, not content. I would do that on my own, but questions about, can I ask this as part of the content? I was very ambitious in what I was hopeful that we could do. And he would always have to rein me in and say, you have these big ideas, but you have to remember that your crew hasn't been trained on how to do these things. So it was always a matter of, we'll pull back so that it's something that's realistic, where we can all do what we've come in there to do and all succeed at what we're doing, myself included. And he would also, one major exception that nobody else could do there, he was the only one who could touch the lights. So anything that involved the lighting, he was a professional. And fortunately, because of that, the show always looked good. Sometimes we had issues with sound, and, we have volunteers. Sometimes we had issues with the lower third ID, and sometimes we had new people, and sometimes I fumbled, and sometimes I'd drop something. But that's just part of public access. But I did have all these other people helping me. So when it came time to actually going into the studio, I walked in with my questions. I knew what I was going to talk about, and I was able to detour if necessary. And I didn't have to worry at all about anything technical until after the show. And I made arrangements to come in and do some post-production editing. And even then I had help. So I didn't have to do any of the technical stuff on my own.
I'm curious to know what those ideas that you approached your mentor with, what those were that he said, nah, let's just keep it simple. What were the
I had these ideas for things I want to do with the opening roll-in. I wanted to do something with like a green screen in the background and project book covers and project scenes from book signings, because they had some of the equipment there, but everything wasn't aligned. I don't know what you call it. Some of the things through the computer, the wiring, the electrical things didn't match what they had with the physical things with the screen. And so even though I saw I knew what I was looking at. They weren't equipped yet to handle it, and the crew would have to be trained on it. I also wanted to learn how to do the teleprompter. So I tried that. They did set me up one time to try it. That was terrible. That was absolutely terrible.
So this 30-minute show that you did, no teleprompter, you're just going, I guess, from note cards or from cue cards, or
I had a couple index cards with me, just some bullet points for things I wanted to ask. And if the question was something that I thought the guest might stumble with, I always wrote the answer underneath it. Would have been something that I found on their website or in one of their books or something, because I never wanted the guest to be caught and think, all right, oh my gosh, I don't know.
All right, I'm gonna stop you right there, because I want to talk a little bit about that, because when I was just starting in radio, and we're talking real radio about 15 years ago, and I still have a tendency to do this. I think some people get nervous when it comes to what we call dead air. Like, like an awkward pause in a conversation, that's bad enough. But when the tape is rolling and when you've got a crew there and everybody's watching you, you don't want to be caught empty-handed, right?
Right.
So there's a tendency for people to, I think, lead in and be like, well, is it like this or is it like this? And give answers, or a tendency to do that. Are you still doing that when you do interviews with people, or is that something that, like me, it kind of faded away and you just have to trust that the guest is going to be able to answer that question without your help?
It depends. Sometimes if the answer is not critical to the arc of the interview, then I let the guest go where they're going to go. I prepare well enough that we can take a detour. And I've got like a gypsy soul. I'm fine with going on detours and let's see where they go. By the same token, if there's some particular point that I wanted to make in the interview, I will use a leading question to draw the guest back so that I can get the answer to that particular question.
So you're talking about a topic, not a specific answer that you want to be drawn out, but a topic.
Even then, David, I know that what I've done is I'll ask a question and say, do you feel it's something like this or something like this or something else? So that I want them to know that I want them to talk, let's say, about colors, not about taste. I don't want them to say, oh, yes, Zita, it's answer A or answer B that you just gave me. But I want them to know that here's the area I want to talk about.
Yeah. It's direction. I like where you're going with that, because I think that's the fine balance that we have as interviewers. It's not about us yet. We are in charge of the show. As I say, we're in charge of landing the plane. And when you've got 30 minutes, and you do when you're on broadcast or cable, in this case, satellite, whatever, it's not like a podcast where we can go on and on and on. You can be that gypsy person. Man, you got those segments and you got to get in and out of them. We've got a commercial break coming up. And I'm always amazed when I hear guys that are really good at it. I'm like, man, that was smooth. And I don't think people are smooth all the time. But you know what I'm talking about, Zita, where you just have those episodes where it's like everything worked. Like, man,
yes.
I was really good. Where I've gotten caught with that is I start thinking I can do it again, or I can do it every time.
Yeah.
And then you'll have a guest that'll come in and they'll humble you. And like, I'm not as good as I thought I was.
Yep, that's for sure.
So I want to know this, because it sounds like when you were doing television and then in your transition to podcasting, some of the work that you were doing, you talked about the post-production, in some ways is very similar, although you're working with audio and video, not just audio.
Yes.
But one of the things that it is this way for most podcasters is it's just you on your podcast, especially a solo episode, in that you've got to do, you talked about lower thirds, which if you don't know lower thirds, that's the bottom of a screen.
Yeah, like a little identity.
Zita Christian ritual recipes. It would let you know who's talking.
Yeah.
You're in charge of things like that, or the audio version of that. You're in charge of your sound. You're in charge of editing. You're in charge of uploading. And did you have any thoughts on, some people, I think they will bring in co-hosts, or they will bring in, producers, even though they're doing the most of the work, just because they don't want to have the full responsibility. It's emotionally too difficult on them. Did that affect you at all?
I'm quite the opposite. I'm quite the opposite. I will tell you, when I was growing up, I have two younger sisters, and every year at Christmas time, when we were, 7, 8, 10 years old, that area, we gave each other coloring books and a new box of crayons for Christmas. And every year, my sisters would give me a coloring book where the main character was Lucy from the Peanuts comic strip, because they said that I was like Lucy. I was very bossy.
Yeah, she's a boss.
But I was the oldest, and I thought I'm in charge. I mean, I'm in charge. These two sisters are my responsibility, and I have never shied away from responsibility.
I think that's a good thing when you're a podcast producer or you're the main talent. Working in the music industry for a number of years, people don't realize this, but when you see a band, and let's say the band is 3 or 4 people, usually the way that works, how it's structured is it's one guy, he's in charge, he's hiring the other guys out, like a hired gun type of thing, like a work for hire. It's an emotional thing. He's still in charge. They submit to him. And I think that a lot of creative things are like that. Somebody's got to be the driver simply to have that train rolling. Otherwise, you get in these conversations like, well, I'll have the color blue, I'll have the color yellow, I'll have the color red. You get caught up in other things. You have to be on that same bus, or that train is a better example, because there's a track and it has to be going in the exact same place. So I can completely relate to that. At the same time, I do think it is scary, because if it fails, it's all on you. And you have to look at yourself and you have to say, well, I can't blame it on anybody. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was.
That's what I need to know if I'm growing. I look for those experiences where I know there's a good chance I'm going to fail. Because when I do, then I know I've worked another muscle. I've tried something new. I've picked up a tool, and maybe I don't know how to use it yet. And maybe I really mess up the piece of wood, the cloth, the whatever it is that I'm working with. But I'm trying something different. I have to keep stretching.
I like that. I heard a quote by a guy named Rich Litvin, and he wrote a book called Prosperous Coach. Most coaches, they're at least familiar with it, they know about it, life coaching. And he had a quote I thought was great. He said that if you're the most interesting person in the room, you are in the wrong room.
That's right.
And I've often thought that about musicianship. Like I said, coming from a music background, I don't want to be the best guitarist. I want to go in there with people who are better than me that I can learn from. That's how you get better. But again, it's a nice ego stroke to get in there and have everybody say, oh, Zita, you're the best. You're the best.
It is.
We bow down to you. I think there's something about doing the work, though, that I love. And I'm thankful that I actually love this, that it's enough to me, just doing the work and trying to get better. It's a very personal thing, even though we're creating something for somebody else.
David, I'll tell you, early on in the first year of doing the podcast, someone emailed me. I don't remember the woman's name, but she operated a podcast production service, editing service. I'm really not quite sure what you call it. And she said, oh, I see you have a podcast, and you can send your audio files to me, and I can make them sound better, and I can do your show notes for you, and I can do this and that. And at the time, I was so new that I didn't realize that eventually I'd get a bunch of those kind of emails every week, that somebody was just fishing to see if somebody else needed the service and wanted to buy it. At the time, I thought, oh, wow, somehow she really found me and she really wants to help me. Yeah. I wrote back to her and I thanked her for reaching out to me. And I said I was really flattered that, she said she'd like the podcast. And of course, now I realize she probably never listened to any of it. But I remember telling her that much as I liked the idea of having somebody else do some of these pieces because they were so foreign to me, they were so difficult. I mean, difficult for me. I would get so frustrated. I would wad up paper. I would get up from my desk and walk around and muttering under my breath. They were so frustrating. But as I mentioned to her, and I told her how old I was, and I said, I'm at an age where it would be a lot more convenient for me to say, sure, here's my credit card, here's the file, go fix it and send it back to me all nice and clean and polished. Yeah. But because of my age, I know how critical it is that I know how to keep up with what's going on. I don't ever want to be dependent on somebody else for producing a creative endeavor, except books. That's a different animal to me. But there were so many times in the production of the television show, not in the studio, but afterwards when I went to load it up to YouTube, I had challenges and they were big, and I reached out to other people for help, and it didn't work out well. And I thought, I don't want that to happen again. I need to know how to do this. So I said to the young woman, I hope that when you are my age, that you will not shy away from something that is challenging and different just because you're old. She wrote back to me. She wrote a lovely note back to me, and that was the end of it. And it wasn't until, months later when I realized, oh my gosh, I get these emails every week, that I was nothing special to her, but she was to me.
I like that because, for one, if you're going to hire something out, I think it's important that you know basically how it works, what the process is. That way you can advise. That way if you know it's good or if it's not good. But the other thing I think of from a content perspective is that, especially with editing, and my book talks about this, and you see these guys and they want to, they're the kind of guys, they have like an Apple Watch and they're like, I burned 400 calories. Tomorrow I'm going to burn 401. They're always trying to improve. Mm-hmm. In some ways we're talking about improvement, but I'm not talking about that kind of improvement. I don't want to be somebody who's worried about numbers. I want to be worried about honestly getting better and not worrying about stats. And now, speaking of age-old moments, I lost my train of thought, Zita. So this is, I'm going off. I'm trying to think. Okay, I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna be that slick guy who starts this interview and lands the plane so perfectly. Basically, what I'm getting at though is when you are editing yourself, you get really good at, or you should get really good, really familiar, maybe is a better word, with the the ahs, the crutches that you have, the same questions that you're asking. And I would think even with television, there's more of that because you've got video and you're having to look at yourself, not just hear yourself. And you say, oh, I'm kind of slouching, or I'm doing this in a weird way. I feel like that's scary to a lot of people. Maybe one of the reasons why a lot of people just outsource it. They're like, I don't want to look at it. It's a little bit too exposing. With that said, do you ever feel that this kind of thing, like putting yourself out on television or putting yourself out via your podcast and talking stories, like you mentioned your husband, earlier on in this interview, that's a pretty honest thing and it's a pretty personal thing. And in some ways, I don't think anybody thinks anything of it, but I think sometimes personally to us, there are things about us that we don't necessarily want to share. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, just being somebody who's been at life for a while, how that's changed for you about sharing parts of yourself and what do you keep secret and what do you, how do you know what to share?
Well, had it not been for a social worker I'm working with, I might not share it with anyone other than family and close friends. She has advised me of the importance of, number one, accepting the reality, and number two, being able to talk about it openly because, not for my own benefit in the sense of getting comfortable with accepting the reality. I have to do that inwardly. But what happens when I talk about it is that other people reach out to me and they'll tell me, I know what you're going through. I went through that with my mother, or my sister is going through that with her husband now, or any number of relationships. And what I find is this is not as isolating. It's not as isolating I don't even know the right word to put with it. It's a trauma. It's a trauma. It's a cruel disease. And there are a lot of other people going through it as well, having the disease. And there are people going through as I am and being caretakers. And I find that when we can be open about it, the openness creates the opportunity for a tribe to gather if they want to. It's not like saying, here, I'm going to have a support group about this and come and join if you want to. The end result is the same, but the process is more organic because someone will either feel comfortable with me, feel that they can trust what I'm saying, or more importantly, feel that I will respect a confidence, that I will understand what it is that they're going through, and that they will confide something in me. And it is that creation of a tribe in an organic way. And that's the only reason that I'm putting it out, because I think that we can help each other by being open about what it is we're going through. But something else you mentioned just before that, it brought to mind when I go into post-production at the television studio, and I'm sitting in the editing room with my advisor, and we're looking at the video, and sometimes it's a simple thing of we're just putting in opening credits and closing credits and some nice little transitions to blend the two. Sometimes we have to fix things in the middle. And what will happen when we're going through the middle and he's teaching me something at the same time, and he just stops the video on whatever frame it happens to be on. and you know,
Always weird.
Yes. Now I understand why those magazines, those Inquirer, and where they show a picture of somebody in this horrible, horrible pose. And I think, oh my gosh, how did they even capture something like that? Well, now I know how, because there's a gazillion thousand of them out there that are possible from the videos I've done. And the first couple of the times it happened, I looked at the frame and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't say turn it off, because this isn't an ego thing. He's helping me learn how to edit. And I'm sitting there like, oh gosh, I don't want to look at myself like that.
Yeah.
And then after about, I would say maybe a couple months of that, I just decided, oh well,
Yeah.
that's who I am. And I will have those days where I have gone in and I desperately needed a haircut. I mean, desperately. I have big hair and it grows fast, and I have to go in every 4 weeks to get cut. And there will be times where it'll be like the 5th week, and one time it was like the 6th week.
Yeah.
Because, and I tried everything to make it look small, and I couldn't. And I knew that I couldn't reschedule the guest. He or she was very, very hard to get a hold of and get on the calendar. I didn't want to lose the opportunity. And I thought, well, the heck with how my hair looks. That's not why people are watching. That's not why they're listening. They want to know about the guest. Yeah. Well, I look back at some of those now, and I think, oh my gosh, didn't I realize that was going to be out there like forever? But at the same token, I wouldn't do it differently. It's just not about me.
All right, speaking of landing the plane, I had to land the plane just like we talked about. It's up to me to get you out of that. And the conversation was going so well, I wanted to keep it going. I mentioned this at the top of the episode. This is the first part of the conversation. We've got a second part talking more with Zita Christian. That is coming on the next episode of Red Podcast. There's a lot more to the conversation. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. She's got so much insight into podcasting, so much insight into building an expert business, and really about life in general, doing life your way and making your situation work for you. If you want more from Zita Christian right now, ritualrecipes.net is where she lives on the internet. And to make sure that you don't miss the next part of this conversation that you just heard, you can subscribe to Red Podcast. To do that, go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe. You'll see some of the podcasts that I'm involved with there. Red Podcast, it's easy to spot because the artwork is red. And below that artwork, I've got 3 buttons for you. One for iPhone. So if you're listening to this podcast on your iPhone, click the iPhone button. I'll get you hooked up. If you're on an Android, I've got an Android button for you. And if you want an old-fashioned RSS feed, if you've been in podcasting for a while, you know how to use it. I got you there too. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe has it all, as well as some of the other podcasting resources that I have. If you want to grow your audience, spread your message in that way, Check it out while you are there. Thank you so much for listening to Red Podcast, the marketing podcast for experts. Up next, the continuation of my talk with Zita Christian about spreading your message, jumping into podcasting and jumping into spreading your message in a new way. You're going to get a lot out of it. So go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Do that, and the next part of this conversation with Zita Christian will be delivered to you automatically. See you on the next episode of Red Podcast.